Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies colloquium this afternoon. My name is Wenqin Ye. I am Professor of History and Director of Institute of East Asian Studies here at Berkeley. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this inaugural Elvira Kwon Som Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. This new endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this new endowment, we will be able to bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall to present a public lecture, meet with faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange and debate among colleagues. The namesake of this new series, Elvira Kwon Som Lim, or Lin Guangchan in Chinese, was born in Shantou, Guangdong in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. She passed away in Oakland, California on March 27, 2006. The center continues to work with the Lim family, which has pledged to support additional activities regarding graduate research at Berkeley. With that, I would like to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Nicola D. Cosmo, who is the Henry Luce Foundation Professor of East Asian Studies at the Institute of Advanced Study. The Professor D. Cosmo received his bachelor's degree in Chinese studies from University of Venice in Italy, and then his doctoral degree in Inner Asian History, the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, Indiana University. He has taught at several institutions, including Harvard University, where he launched the Inner Asian Studies program. He is also the author of several important books, including Diary of a Manchu Soldier in 17th Century China, which I believe many of you must have seen. It's a wonderful find. It's a wonderful text in Manchu, which he has translated into English. And then also a documentary history of Manchu-Mongol relations from 1616 to 1626, an edited volume, Political Frontiers, Ethnic Boundaries, and Human Geographies in Chinese History, which was published in 2003, and best known to this audience here, Ancient China and Its Enemies, The Rise of Nomadic Power in East Asian History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2002, and then also several other edited volumes and editions, which I will not enumerate in the interest of time. And I am certainly happy to say, since I have been given, unfortunately for me, the unenviable responsibility to be a commentator on his paper, that his paper today, his presentation today, at least is moving historically in a direction a little bit closer to my research, although still about 500 years apart. Namely, he's going to present to us on the rise of Manchu power in Northeast Asia, 1600 to 1636, with the subtitle Local and Global Dimensions. So let us welcome Professor Nicola D. Cosmo.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to thank, of course, the Center for Chinese Studies, all the people involved, Professor Ye, John Groschwitz, the donors, everybody for bringing me here. It's my first time at Berkeley University. And although I didn't expect the rain, it's wonderful to be here. I decided to present this particular topic today because I'm sort of moving back into early Qing studies. As Professor Ye has graciously mentioned, I've done some translations, I've published articles here and there, but my larger project is really to consider or reconsider writing about the Manchu conquest of China and exploring new threads, new directions, new trails, as I call them, which we can use to reconceptualize, reconfigure, rethink how this minute group of people from Northeast Asia managed to conquer China. Frederick Wakeman's The Great Enterprise, published over 20 years ago, is still today the only available book in English on the Manchu conquest of China. It's erudite, it's meticulously researched, beautifully written, encyclopedic in scope. It's the standard narrative of a set of traumatic events in Chinese history, the end of the Ming dynasty and the birth of the Qing. So I'm going to begin this talk today with a brief discussion of this work. And I should say from the start that 20 years after I first read it, my admiration for it remains undimmed. Now, to the best of my knowledge, before Wakeman's Great Enterprise, the only detailed account of the Manchu conquest available to a Western audience was the rather indigestible translation, German translation of the Huanqing Kaiwo Fanyue, the account of the foundation of the Imperial Qing dynasty by Eric Hauer, published in 1926, which covers the period from 1583 to 1644. This is not a work of history. This is a source, of course. In English, only portions of the stories have been told in collective volumes, such as will be known to everybody here, From Ming to Qing, edited by Spence and Wills, or in brilliant but rather narrowly focused research, such as the Southern Ming by Lin Struve. Wakeman's study, on the contrary, is a work of history that does provide a full narrative account of the entire period of the end of the Ming and founding of the Qing. Its central focus, as the subtitle says, is not the conquest of China by the Manchus per se, or the subjugation of China by foreign conquerors, but rather the reconstruction of imperial order in China. A reviewer, when the Great Enterprise came out, remarked that this is a masterpiece not because it achieves some infallible perfection, but because it represents the very best that a first-rate Western historian of China could reasonably be expected to produce in the 1980s. It is important to remind ourselves of what the central issues of that book are. The accommodation between ruling elites, the Manchu's creation of a civil bureaucracy, Chinese generals' defections and resistance, in some case, Ming literati's various reactions to their new masters. The collapse of an inept court dominated by eunuchs and southerners is compensated on the other side of the Great Wall by the success story of the Manchus, a healthy and strong people that exploited the weakness of the Ming but preserved its system of bureaucratic government by cajoling military and civil officers into shifting loyalties and payroll. Now, the story is told in compelling terms, and the sheer amount of detail is certainly intimidating. Yet none of the reviewers at the time seemed to believe that the Great Enterprise would remain the last word on the Manchu conquest for very long. especially because more documents were at the same time being made available. The most critical remark I could find among the many accolades was that the book provided no new frame of interpretation. As Kent Guy wrote, it provided many interesting perspectives, but failed to knit them together into one all-encompassing view of the founding of the Qing dynasty, especially a new view. Today, it is harder to define that absence of an all-encompassing view a failure, considering that in the 22 years since its publication, no one has even attempted to pick up the challenge adumbrated in Kent Guy's criticism. This consideration is all the more urgent because of the extraordinary development of the field of early Qing studies in the same time span. Today, a student of early Qing history can use the works in alphabetical order by Crossley, Eliot, Milward, Perdue, Roski, Struve. The first Qing volume of the Cambridge History of China has recently been published, quite a number of books. But it is remarkable that for all the buzz around the new Qing history, no new encompassing interpretation of the Manchu conquest has been attempted. I think the great enterprise has stood the test of time. In terms of actually trying to explain why and how the Manchus conquered China, however, I think still today we are unable to go beyond analysis that ultimately go back to 17th and 18th century ideas generated within the milieu of Ming and Qing literati writings and Qing official historiography. In the last instance, we are still anchored to a perspective that perceives the Qing conquest as an opportunistic act, the result of the Ming failure to control the devastating crisis of the 1630s and 40s, with the Manchus portrayed as stereotypical northern warriors who made deals with Chinese generals and literati while they waited for their time to pounce on China. One has to wonder how the history of Manchuria in the 40-odd years from the early 1600s to 1644 truly relates to the Manchu conquest of China, and whether it is not a parallel story that at some point accidentally intersects that of the fall of the Ming. Its relevance seems to be limited to those factors that can be useful to explain the post-1644 reconstruction of imperial order. The Qing pacification and recruitment of the provincial elites during the war against the Southern Ming, the struggle to defeat rebel enemies, the territorial unity of China, not just preserved, but actually expanded by the Manchus, and the prosperity gradually brought back to the Chinese economy. But none of these aspects can actually explain how the Manchus reached the point of actually conquering China. Even in the most sophisticated recent studies, the temptation to look at the origins of Manchu power from the perspective of those elements that continue to have currency after 1644 is quite strong. The banner system, social and economic institutions, elements of imperial ideology, ethnicity, that appear to be the defining traits of the Qing dynasty. However, I think such a retrospective interpretation of the conquest period only provides a skewed or at least self-limited reading of the pre-conquest period. At the same time, we need to be critically aware of the limitations of theories that assume that the Manchus, being closer than other so-called Inner-Asian peoples to the Chinese mode of production, that is agriculture, could synthesize more easily, and therefore absorb more readily Chinese institutions that made it possible for them to eventually rule China. If the Manchus developed agriculture in the late 16th century, as they certainly did, I would like to ask how they did so, rather than assume that this was just a necessary stage on the road to becoming Chinese. Yet another problematic tendency is that which stresses the historical linkages within between the Manchus and the imperial nomads of previous eras, focusing on those shared elements such as the political culture, traditional values, military institutions that may define the Manchus as a so-called conquest dynasty. Every dynasty is a conquest dynasty, of course. Undoubtedly, the Eurasian roots of the Manchus also represent an aspect, let's say, of the discourse of the rise of the Manchu. But we need to ask, what is truly innovative, unique, dynamic, contingent to the Manchu conquest? That's the kind of questions that I'm interested in. We are in danger of pitching, in other words, one flawed notion of cyclical history, that is the Chinese dynastic cycle, against another, the Eurasian imperial cycle, that is just as flawed, as if cyclicality and the conceptual baggage that comes with it provide the only codes that we can use to organize our knowledge of this period. So today I'm going to talk about some apparently unrelated aspects of early Manchu history. And my talk today could have had sort of Jared the Diamond title, Guns, Silvers, and Relatives, or Lakoff type title, Firearms, Wives, and Other Dangerous Things, such as money. In brief, the three stories I'm going to tell discuss guns, silver, and wives, or marriages. That is, military, economic, and diplomatic aspects that led to really fundamental changes in early Manchu or Jurchen society. These are the trails that I propose to follow, which, like as many Ariadne's threads, may take us out of the labyrinth of cyclical history. I propose to talk, in other words, about, and I shouldn't say this in front of Professor Ye, about Manchu modernity. That is, about changes in a society that are so radical that there is no way back, for better or worse, and that are by no means unrelated to greater regional and even global transformations. So let's start with firearms. I became interested in firearms a few years ago, and I've discovered that quite a number of people, including Taiwan and Japan, have also been writing on this topic. Now, the subject of firearms refers to the arms race, what I call an arms race, between the Manchus and the Ming dynasty that took place especially in the 1620s and 1630s. At the Battle of Mount Shahu was an epochal battle in 1619 that was won by the Manchus. Now, at that battle, the Manchus had to confront a Ming army laden with heavy artillery, muskets, bombards, cannons, and accompanied also by Korean auxiliary troops, also armed with numerous firearms. Now, this was not the first time that the Manchus encountered firearms. Yet, time and again, the Manchu sources tell us that these weapons had no effect whatsoever. They mostly missed their targets, but even when they actually hit somebody, sort of bounced off, even when they hit the bare flesh. And so the Manchus, at some point, even started to believe that they were protected by heavenly spirits, ironically strengthening their resolve. Our sources, in fact, suggest a few sort of earthly reasons why guns and muskets failed to inflict much damage. In one case, the Manchu assault against a group of heavily armed Chinese soldiers took place under intermittent rain, which may have contributed to the failure of the guns. But in general, it just seems that these weapons were inferior, and the skills of these Chinese gunners and musketeers were also inferior. The Manchus, in other words, were not intimidated at all. Nonetheless, it's interesting to note that as soon as the Manchus conquered Liaodong, here entered through Fushun, through this area, and Liaoyang was their capital, and then Shenyang. As soon as they entered, in other words, Chinese Ming areas, they started to recruit Chinese troops equipped with firearms. So clearly, by 1622, they had started to move into a program, at least, of developing firearm troops, troops armed with firearms. So at this point, however, in the early 1620s, a new set of characters enters this scene, this arms race. And these are the Europeans, the Portuguese, and some influential Chinese Christian converts. Xu Wenqi, Sun Yuanhua, Li Zhizao. These are important people who became the mediators between the Ming court and Portuguese interests in Macau. Now, these Christian literati persuaded the Ming emperor to adopt large European-made cannons from the Macau foundries to be used to defend the capital and frontier cities against Manchu incursions. Their suggestion was accepted, and the northeastern defense sector was equipped with European-made heavy artillery. This decision was proved well-founded in 1626, when the fortress of Ninyuan successfully resisted a Manchu assault. Should be Ninyuan. Oh, here it is. Nurhaci, the founder of the Manchu state, himself was wounded, and he died in 1626 as a consequence of those wounds. We may note that according to the Manchu sources, it was not the cannons, this heavy artillery, that was responsible for their defeat, but the Manchus' own lack of preparation. They say that they had short ladders, so they could not climb the walls, insufficient training, they were complacent. This is what we find in the Manchu sources. Yet Ming generals, who were there actually at Ninyuan, saw that heavier guns, so long-range artillery, was indeed the main factor behind the successful defense of Ninyuan. The problem was that the Manchus did not know how to mount a siege. So they could only storm the city, and once they were blocked, they did not know what to do. They did not know how to mount a siege against a fortress armed, in fact, with this long-range artillery. And therefore did not recognize the problem at once, but it did not take them actually too long to change course. In 1627, Hung Taiji, Nurhaci's son and successor, just 1 year after the defeated Ninyuan, began the next phase of the arms race and launched a program meant to outfit the Manchu army with proper siege artillery, so these large Dutch, Portuguese cannons. They got this European-style artillery mostly from the Ming. They stole it from the Ming, or they made it themselves on the basis of Ming and European models. This new technology enabled the Manchu to lay a successful siege at the fortress of Dalinhe, which is here, in 1631, and to close this technological gap. They were able, 4 years later, after the defeat in Ninyuan, 5 years later, to actually mount a successful siege. Now, the consequences of this catching up were momentous. Not only had the Manchus acquired access to state-of-the-art technology, but they were also starting to integrate Chinese soldiers, trans-frontier people from Liaodong, and also Chinese troops from Shandong into their army, a process that eventually led to the formation of the Hanjun, the Chinese banners. How can this story change our understanding of the Manchu conquest? Well, first, it sheds light on its internal dynamism. It is clear that a number of strategic choices made by the Manchus depended exclusively upon the essential requirement, in my view, to fight wars that they could win and to win wars that they were forced to fight. They would do anything possible to win these wars, including changing their way of thinking about warfare. So it poses the problem of the centrality of war to the rise of the Manchus as a regional power. There is no inherent reason why we should regard the construction of a bureaucratic state as a more central concern for the early Manchus than the construction of an efficient army capable of multiple tasks. So very different from the traditional methods of fighting. Therefore, we need to look more closely at war as a major factor of change in Manchu society. Not through the deceptive notion of the sort of in-nation martial prowess, almost like a second nature to the Manchus, but rather as a factor of social change. War as a factor of social change with the integration of these other people and the creation of the banners and the whole transformation of Manchu elite society. By investing in military technology, the Manchus were able to integrate, therefore, in their military machines, non-Manchu people external to their former social basis. And we should even refer, if only fleetingly perhaps, to the debate now over 50 years old on the military revolution in Western Europe. I think we find elements of that debate that are valid for our purposes here. The military revolution in sort of Renaissance Europe stresses the impact on society of changes in military organization, financing, technology, tactics, and looking at changes in Manchu politics and society through the lens of this military revolution debate, we can see that the incorporation of firearms was indeed responsible for greater centralization of power, which is one of the hallmarks, one of the characteristics of this period of growth of the Manchu state. The limited but very important, I think, therefore, modernization of the Manchu army over the period between 1616 or 1620 and 1636 owes also much to changes, let's not forget, occurring in the global environment of East-Western relations, not to traditional steppe warfare. In other words, we have to consider also the impact of this new technology brought to China and how the Manchus could learn how to use it in this very short period of time, something that the Chinese did not do. Changes in Manchu society as a consequence of this global transformation seem to be faster and more and deeper than they are for China. Second topic, or second thread, the diplomatic marriages between Manchus and Mongols. Let's take the year 1627. This was a critical year in the history of the conquest. Chinese resistance to the Manchu occupation of Liaodong had stiffened as a result of the development of ethnic strife between Manchus and Chinese. The economy was in very critical shape due to scarce agricultural production. The military defeat suffered in Ninyuan, which I just mentioned, demonstrated that the Manchu army was not invincible. Nurhaci had died, and to top it all, the Manchu state was now run by a committee of 8 aristocrats. This was, I think, the lowest point reached by the Manchus since their rise in the early 1600s. And what was at stake was not so much the expansion of the Manchu state, but its very survival. To overcome the crisis, Hun Taiji got rid of the committee in an expedite and somewhat ruthless, but I think not senseless way. And once he took control of the state, he needed to address almost immediately a very serious issue, and that was the civil war among the Mongol tribes in this area here. It's a very complicated issue that I'm just going to mention briefly here. The Mongols were very important to the Manchus at this time. Why? First of all, they were being used by the Ming dynasty in a sort of anti-Manchu function role to protect China's borders against the Manchus. More importantly, with Ming financial support, some Mongols, for instance, the Chakra Mongols, led by a leader called Ligdan Khan, tried to establish a new Mongol empire. And this new Mongol empire was on a direct collision course with the Manchu state. So the Manchus, at the same time, had tried quite desperately to establish good relations with the Kokchin Mongols and a few other tribes that could have shifted to the enemy camp of Ligdan Khan. So it's a very complicated picture here. In these oaths of allegiance, alliances made between Manchus and Mongols, we often find a proviso that the Mongols must help the Manchus in their struggle against the Ming. So the Manchus do not want to face both the Ming and the Mongols. In addition, many Mongol refugees were streaming into Manchu-controlled territory at the time when the economy was not great. So more mouths to be fed, so to speak. Had the Manchus become very deeply embroiled in the Mongol wars after 1627, they would have risked suffering devastating military losses at this critical juncture. Moreover, the Mongols who joined the Manchus often proved to be fickle, undisciplined, not very reliable allies. So a purely military solution was simply not viable. They could not fight the Mongols at this point. Much more preferable was a diplomatic, and probably the only solution was a diplomatic and political solution supported by limited military intervention. So we have to consider how this diplomacy worked. And diplomacy in inter-Asian tribal relations, broadly speaking, operated through a class system and through a kinship system. Clan and tribal aristocracies recognized each other as the upper crust of society and established relations by marrying each other. At the beginning of his career, Nurhaci promoted an active policy of intermarriage between himself mainly and other Jurchen and Mongol clans. Nurhaci's marriages follow sort of closely the twists and turns of his political rise. Among his royal concubines, we find no fewer than 13 Mongol ladies. The relationship between the Kokchin Mongols in particular, written Kokchin here, and the Manchu royal clan became particularly close after 1614. In 1614, Hun Taiji and his two brothers, Hauge and Dorgon, married aristocratic women of the Bojigid clan of the Kokchin, and a number of other sons of Nurhaci followed suit. Hun Taiji participated in this Manchu-Mongol marriage diplomacy very actively. He married altogether 7 Mongol women, 3 of whom occupied the highest possible ranks. And all of them came from this Kokchin tribe. On the other hand, 10 out of 14 daughters of Hun Taiji married Mongol aristocrats. In other words, this is genetic engineering on a considerable scale. So a marriage alliance was a form. Why would they marry so much? Among other things, it's very interesting to look at these documents because they explain the psychology behind some of this diplomacy. A marriage alliance was also a form of insurance against the worst possible outcome of steppe warfare, namely that one's family could be wiped out entirely, with the consequent elimination of the whole genetic pool of a given clan. This type of anxiety is revealed in several texts, oaths of alliances, involving these marriage agreements. And as the parties explicitly say that the offspring of a woman married into a powerful clan would allow the line to continue. So marriage politics can be seen as a way also to mitigate the effects of steppe warfare, which was fairly ruthless. Finally, existing marriage relations allowed political leaders to find common political ground even after they had been at war with each other. This is interesting. The Jarut Mongols, this is another Mongol tribe, made several marriage alliances with the Manchus, but in 1619 they shifted to the Ming, so they became enemies of the Manchus. A few years later, they decided to resume their political ties with the Manchus, and this was facilitated by the existence of previous marriage agreements. They said, in other words, we have been married, we have fallen apart, but let's be friends again because we are kin, we are related to each other. When we speak of the steppe nomads finding unity at cyclical intervals, imperial nomads, so to speak, the Mongols, the Khitan, before them the Turks, and finally the Manchus, we should not forget that the political process is a process that does not have a preordained outcome. In fact, in this case, we could have an Eurasian unity created by the Mongols, not by the Manchus, and that would have been completely different from the state that the Manchus created. The economic reconstruction of Manchuria, the successful transition to a different type of army, are just, I think, some of the characteristics of a new historical context, let's say, in which one has to position traditional Manchu-Mongol relations or traditional ways of conducting diplomatic relations. The Manchus were able to use this traditional system of making alliances, but in a completely new context. Had the Mongols re-imperialized, to use Jim Millwood's term, in Eurasia, even using the same methods, the result would have been completely different because their society was just not developing in the way that the Manchus were. This is simplified, but my point is that simply we cannot consider in Eurasia as one historical unit in itself. Even more importantly, integrating the Mongol aristocracy within the very top echelons of the Manchu elite deeply transformed the Manchu state. In fact, it created a bi-ethnic state. It's not just Manchu, it's Manchu and Mongol. A great number of Mongols were incorporated in the very fabric of Manchu society. The banners, of course. Most importantly, at the institutional level, establishing Manchu rule over Mongolia required the creation of new institutions, such as the linchpin of the future colonization of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and so on, which is the Lifan Yuan. The Lifan Yuan, the Office for the Administration of the Outer Regions, was created by the Manchus in the 1630s exactly because they wanted to rule Mongolia. So, regardless of the presence of Mongol elements in the Manchu political culture, the Qing cannot be regarded as the political successor of the Mongols or the Yuan dynasty. This is an argument I have with other Eurasianists mostly. We are looking at a new synthesis, at a new historical synthesis that really includes elements of tradition in Eurasian politics, but the government tools, the cultural expressions of this tradition served mainly to reach a new level of imperial unity not previously reached by Eurasian so-called empires. Last point, and most complicated, is, and also most fascinating, is money. After firearms and marriages, you get to money, and specifically trade, silver. In the early phase of Nurhaci's rise to power, that is late 16th, early 17th century, we see that the number of Manchu merchants recorded at various border market towns, and that's in this area here, near Fushun, Kiling, and so on, this area. the number of Manchu merchants increases considerably. Towards the end of the 16th century, it is by no means surprising to find parties of several hundred merchants recorded as entering a certain market town. So the commercialization of the northern frontier from the second half of the 15th century onwards is a well-attested phenomenon, not limited to the Manchurian region, but also extending to southern Mongolia. The Mongols also had privileged access to a number of market towns, and competition to monopolize trade at these access points was fierce. As we mentioned before, Ligdan Khan, the head of the Chahars, launched a full-scale war to preserve access to the border town of Guanning, and in Guanning, that was in 1619. And in 1628, a Chahar caravan numbering 3,000 merchants, presumably en route to Chinese markets, was completely wiped out. 3,000 people were killed by a hostile Mongol force. So the rise of Nurhaci is intimately connected to the increase in the trade between the southern Jurchen, the Zhengzhou Jurchen in this area, the Zhengzhou Jurchen, and China. The young Nurhaci was personally involved in the tremendously lucrative ginseng trade, and a great amount of Manchu folk literature, in fact, revolves on the romanticization of Nurhaci's prowess as a ginseng picker. Other highly prized items were furs, pearls, which the trapping and fishing forest economy supplied in abundance. In fact, it is interesting that it's not the animal husbandry or the agriculture that provides the largest cash revenues, but the products of this hunting and gathering economy of Manchuria. The accumulation of commercial capital in Nurhaci's hands was favored by the Ming policy to grant tribute and trading licenses to Manchurian political chieftains and leaders. The early wars of Nurhaci were waged against these license-holding chieftains who, when they were defeated, had to relinquish their trading privileges. Eventually, Nurhaci was able to hold a complete monopoly. There were about 500 licenses, and he controlled all of them for access to this Manchu Chinese trade. Now, within this trade, ginseng was especially lucrative. Ginseng production in China, limited essentially to the Taihang Mountains in Shanxi, was being exhausted towards the end of the Ming Dynasty, creating pressure for ginseng imports. And the best ginseng grounds were in southern Manchuria and northern Korea on that border. So under Nurhaci, control over ginseng production in southern Manchuria was such that Chinese and Korean ginseng poachers were actively prosecuted and often executed. It was a very, very heavy-handed way of dealing with these people. In 1608, the Ming, trying to restrain Nurhaci's political ambitions, punished him by imposing an embargo on ginseng trade for 2 years, which proved a tremendous loss, economic loss for Nurhaci. Apparently 100,000 jin of ginseng were lost during this time, were rotted. Now, if we try to quantify this trade, how much was it? I mean, how much money were they actually getting? And what were they selling back, by the way? What kind of trade was it? Now, a sample of Ming records preserved in the Dongbei Darangwan, Northeastern Archives, informs us of trade. I've not done a complete research, but there's a sort of spotty check on these trade figures. And for instance, in 3 months of 1583 and 3 months of 1585, so towards the end of the 16th century, we find that 11,870 Jurchen merchants entered different border markets to conduct trade transactions. Mostly, the Jurchen imported what? They imported domestic animals, textiles, iron plows for agriculture, and other iron implements. Manchurian exports included ginseng, furs, pearls, and horses. Now, the total value of the Ming exports to Manchuria, what the Manchus bought, was about 850 liang tiles of silver. The total value of just the ginseng sold by the Manchus to the Chinese was 30,000 taels of ginseng. So the trade gap, the imbalance is considerable, and we have to add to that the pearls, the horses, the furs, and so forth. So how was it compensated? Some valuable items that could have been sold to the Manchus, such as silk, for instance, which had a kind of exchange monetary value, are not mentioned. I think they would have been recorded. I think the only or the most likely hypothesis we can make is that silver was used to make up for the difference, which hints at the possibility of a substantial flow of silver bullion from China to southern Manchuria, or just money. Let us then try to calculate the value of the ginseng sales that Nurachi lost during the Ming embargo in these 2 years, 1608, 1609. Now, at the price of 9 ounces of silver per gin, this is a reasonable estimate, we have 900,000 ounces of silver at a weight of 37 grams of silver per ounce. I think that was the main value for weight for an ounce. Then it means that 33,300 kilograms of silver were lost, or 16.65 metric tons per annum. Now, according to Richard von Glann's estimates, the total import of silver in China in the 5 years from 1606 to 1610 was 340.3 metric tons. That is about 68 metric tons per annum. Therefore, the potential sale of Manchurian ginseng alone corresponded in the same time to about 1/4 of the total foreign silver imported in China in a single year. Now, is this possible? It's something that we need to consider, I think. It's interesting enough as a figure that we need to consider it. I'm not suggesting that foreign silver was imported into China, obviously, to pay for Manchurian ginseng, nor do I wish to enter the controversy over imports of silver into China and its effects, and the effects of this diminishing silver imports on the fall of the Ming. I'm not here to argue, whether the fall of silver imports really contributed to the disaster of the 1630s and 40s. But I have to say that all the people who have looked into this problem, Atwell, Flynn and Giraldez, Richard von Glan, and so on, they all seem to be totally convinced that China was the black hole or the sink basin of the world silver. And that just is not true. There was quite a lot of silver going north. In addition to commercial transactions, we also need to consider political transactions. These are just as important as the commercial ones. The Chakha and other Mongol tribes in southern Mongolia got quite a lot of silver as sort of protection money from the Ming, protection from the Manchus. This included about 400,000 ounces of silver per year to the Chakha and the Khalkha Mongols. Ligdan and other Mongol leaders received also direct payments of 240,000 ounces from Datong, 100,000 from the province of Shanxi, 180,000 from the city of Xuanfu, and more rewards sort of made on an ad hoc basis. In 1621 and 1622, respectively, there were disbursements of 300,000 ounces and 360,000 ounces. So we are talking about a lot of money here. And while I consider this research to be only preliminary, we need to stress that whether or not the outflow of silver affected the Chinese economy, I think it definitely made a difference on the much smaller pastoral and agricultural economy of the northern zone. It is therefore conceivable that access to silver reserves in various forms may have been instrumental to the development of handicraft, military production under Nurhaci and the Mongols, and to the creation of a standing army and a civil bureaucracy, and also paid for the high salaries granted to Chinese soldiers who defected to the Manchus in the 1620s and 30s. Moreover, we know that under Nurhaci, the Manchurian economy had become increasingly monetized. We have prices for a head of cattle between 15 and 18 ounces. A slave costs between 25 and 30 ounces. Members of the aristocracy as well as the commoners traded freely among themselves. And there is an interesting case of a Manchu aristocrat in 1635 who was punished by Huntaiji. So his goods and property were requisitioned, and altogether they amounted to 4,000 ounces of silver, 23 small villages, 199 Chinese slaves, 304 servants and artisans. So these sort of rough and ready Manchu warriors were in fact quite rich even before conquering China, it looks like. The central question, therefore, about the end of the Ming perhaps should not be that which economic historians have asked in various forms, that is, did the decline in the flow of silver to China, global silver flow into China in the 1630s and 40s, bring about the end of the Ming dynasty? But rather, this is my question, had less silver been available to China in the early 16th century, would the Manchu economy have developed as much as it did? One thing that I think we need to consider. So, in conclusion, the great enterprise remained a valiant, valid way to view the Ming-Qing transition. But also we need to look at the other side of the Willow Palisade, or the Great Wall. The modernity of the rapid adaptation of the Manchu war machine to new warfare methods, and the creation of a multinational force transformed the so-called conquest elite into a multinational, multicultural one, after all, one of the main traits of the Qing dynasty. The marriage policy and other ways to incorporate the Mongol aristocracy within the Manchu state apparatus led to a strategy in which the Manchus developed a type of colonial rule in the outlying regions unprecedented in terms of its bureaucratic structure and principles of government. The silver issue also brings up the question, can a conquest be accomplished only based on the sparse resources of Manchuria's traditional economy? I think not. So, if we say that China was the black hole of world silver, we are, I think, ignoring the northern frontier trade and other forms of economic transactions which generated, again, based only on a preliminary estimate, a major inflow of silver in Manchuria. So my primary aim was simply to show some of the threads, some of the trails, as I've called, that we can follow to get out of this straitjacket represented by the twin paradigms of the dynastic cycle and the nomadic cycle, and bring the full history of Manchu society and all the changes that it went through at this time into the picture. I'd like to recall a conclusion reached by two economic historians who have looked at this period, Flynn and Giraldez, in an influential essay. They say, and I'm quoting, "Unhappily for the Ming Dynasty, fixing taxes in terms of silver may have created a fiscal crisis that led to the emergence of the Qing dynasty." And yet the same authors also state in the very same essay that, and I quote, "The fact that Spain's empire owed its financial foundation to distant Ming China is a forceful reminder that much of what passes for local history in the early modern period can only be understood in terms of world history." Well, my wish is that following the same logic, we should consider the rise of the Manchus also in terms of the interplay of local and global history. Thank you. I'm sorry, I've taken a bit of time.
I complained to Professor Di Cosmo earlier on about how that I have been assigned an incredibly difficult task trying to find holes in his wonderfully intricate presentation. So he and I have agreed on a division of labor. Namely, I will simply offer an explication of my appreciation of his work. And after that, he will offer self-criticism, telling us what exactly is wrong with his paper and why we should not believe him or follow his argument. So that's the deal that we have struck, hence for the rest of the afternoon. So Professor Di Cosmo smilingly said to me earlier today that Professor Wakeman's work remains one of the most important in the field, and it's far from his intention to come to Berkeley to tell us that those of us who had studied with him for many, many years and have been required to read the great enterprise for our doctoral oral examination have been following the wrong master. So he insisted that's not his enterprise. And then, of course, in his work, as he discussed the work of Eliot and Crossley, and at the same time, as he suggested that despite the advertisement about a new Qing history, they have not really done the new Qing history. He says he's not really doing the new Qing history. But then nonetheless, it seems to me that the best way, for me anyway, an extremely productive way to appreciate his paper is exactly to read it in the context of my understanding of Wakeman, Eliot, Crossley, and the whole question about the Manchu reconstruction of the Chinese empire, which of course was the great enterprise as Professor Wakeman had defined it to be. Now, so for anyone wanting to get into some sort of an appreciation of Professor Wakeman, one has to start, I'm afraid, with the founding figure of our field, modern Chinese history, that the whole field, namely trade and diplomacy on the China coast by John Keane Fairbank. Now, in Fairbank's presentation about the encounter between China and the world, how that finally, on the eve of the Opium War, the two ends of the Eurasian continent finally meet. Fairbank described that as a moment of, on the one hand, this is maritime capitalism, right? Free trade coming to the east. But then at the same time, what was happening on the Chinese end of it? Well, he called that a thing, it's a diarchy, he says, and he characterized it as a Manchu dynasty and a Confucian bureaucracy. Now that's in Fairbank. In Professor Wakeman's The Great Enterprise, when he tells us that finally after putting the Three Feudatory Rebellion was put down in the 1680s, when another kind of equilibrium was achieved, another moment of equilibrium was achieved. He called it a moment of a certain kind of solution. And this was a certain kind of solution achieved on the basis of what? Of the transformation of the Manchus out of their tribal militarized past. Right? They started out in Wakeman's book as a tribal military bureaucracy, and evolving or developing, depending on, you have to choose your verb very carefully depending on where you were going. But anyway, the outcome there was it was an imperial bureaucracy, which was fashioned after the Ming style. So that was the certain kind of solution which Wakeman offered to us as happening at the end of the 17th century. So happily, it was such a wonderful system, combining the tribal prowess or military prowess of the people on the wrong side of the border and the sophistication of Confucian bureaucratic culture, that China at that moment was able to offer enough solution to all these problems of new demographic explosion, shortage of resources, all of these things that you can think of that Europeans presumably were encountering at that moment, that it's because of this equilibrium that China at that particular point in early modern period did not exactly go out there and try to become modern. So that moment of modernity, in other words, by Professor Wakeman's presentation, would have to wait until the Europeans show up. And then also, in that presentation, of course, the Manchus were able to become emperors of China by becoming Chinese, right? As Professor Cosmo put it wonderfully a while ago. So the Wakeman students who were unhappy with that kind of Sinocentric perspective, well, they didn't do much with it, except that in the case of Mark Eliot, he did go out and started talking about the importance of not underestimating Manchu ethnicity as a factor in this newly reconstructed Manchu Empire or Qing dynasty. So Eliot strongly underscored this point, that the Qing dynasty was not exactly a continuation of the Ming dynasty, because this whole Manchu ethnic component cannot be discounted. But nonetheless, within that framework, even as he offered revision to Wakeman's argument about Qing imperial institution as a continuation or a reconstruction of the Ming system, Eliot more or less bought into that whole overarching picture, other than this single most important element there, namely Qing ethnicity was not exactly useless or non-functional in Qing politics. So with that as the backdrop, how does Professor Cosmo, author of Ancient China and Its Enemies and defender of all these people on the other side of the Great Wall, how does he engage this issue? I have to think about our colleague, Yuri Sletskin, for instance, who also care about all the little people on the wrong side of any particular climate zone. So anyway, there is nothing wrong about that. Okay, so what does he do with it? He, of course, launches his strongest protest against those of us occupying the more moderate side of the continent, saying that it's absolutely wrong to believe or to think that people on the other side of the Great Wall were simply people with a culture, with ethnicity, or with a way of life, yet without history or society or state. In other words, we should think about the division within anthropological literature about what people with history and people without history. So he says they do have history. So in the case of the Manchus then, according to him, his paper, as I read it, what was later ethnicized by Eliot or Crossley, both of them in fact, as Manchu, in his analysis, was actually a culture which was produced by a society that has a history, and then also this was a society that produces its culture on the basis of dialectics between material and cultural factors or material and cultural conditions. So changes in those arenas are important. In fact, changes in those arenas were so important that one could speak of a Manchu modernity. Aha. And then, when it comes to this Manchu modernity, we'll come back and Suan Zhang with him later on. But for now, Manchu modernity, as he puts it, why is it so important to put forward in Manchu modernity? Manchu modernity draws attention to the internal dynamics stemming from within Manchuria, out of that place, out of that people, out of that society. In other words, the great enterprise that they ultimately would achieve was their own doing. Unlike in Wakeman's presentation, they achieved the great enterprise, A, by default, for Li Zicheng was there first, and secondly, through emulation. They didn't know how to run an empire. They simply have to learn it from the Chinese. That was the Wakeman presentation. So with the thesis of Manchu modernity, Manchus were not just capable of generating their own internal social dynamics. They were also engaged in a process of state building of their own kind. And beyond that, right, they were able to project the new forms of state or the new institutional contributions that they were able to make to create this large empire that would incorporate Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang. Well, he didn't mention Tibet, so Tibet presumably is left out. But then basically, when it comes to the Qing Empire, half of the Qing Empire was achieved or acquired and maintained on the basis of state-making institutions designed, developed, originated in Manchuria by the Manchus themselves, and then also following or using as their building blocks, so to speak, ingredients of construction elements from their own past, marriage alliance, things of that sort. So if we run down his list of those three aspects of the Qing rise to the Manchu rise to the Qing Empire, let's just put it that way, and then compare those points with the points that might have been teased out of the Wakeman presentation. What are they? So the first one here is it's Professor D. Cosmo's argument is that it's technology, adoption of new technology, such as firearms. Guns do matter, right? It's guns, firearms, the adoption of new technology that would drive social changes. Those are the things that matter, rather than, as in the Wakeman presentation, literacy and bureaucracy. That Wakeman would argue that the Manchus acquired their literacy from the other side of the border, and then also they learned how to build imperial bureaucracy afterwards. So it's less a matter about literacy and institution, especially governing institution, it's much more a factor or an issue about technology, especially technologies of warfare, as opposed to arrangements or tools of civil governance, right? So that's the first contrast with Wakeman. So here, the Jesuits are important, European traders are important, which is yet another way of saying, and it reminds me very much of what Ken Pomerantz would like to say, namely, we all should remind ourselves that capitalism, colonial empires on their fringes are violence prone. These are not peace-loving people out there simply to trade. These are arms traders out there to provoke confrontations. Now, I suspect that Professor Wakeman's view about capitalism is somewhat more, shall we say, a little bit more friendly than this presentation. But anyway, so that would be the first point of contrast between Professor Wakeman and Professor D. Cosmo. And then the second point here is that Professor D. Cosmo stresses the importance of how the Manchus were actually using or making creative use of their traditional means of political arrangements for the purpose of creating new kinds of political arrangements. So instead of their tribal militarized bureaucracy be transformed and be flattened out, be disbanded, and becoming an imperial institution, as in Wakeman's presentation. He offers us a situation or a picture of an unstable tribal alliance, which necessitated the creation of new institutions or the use of diplomatic means in such a way that it made it possible for the Manchus to rule Mongolia, to rule Xinjiang, to engage in that particular form of state building, which could be summed up under the institutional characteristics of the Li Fanyuan, for instance. So the Manchus, in other words, they did not have to sort of progress out of the tribal state in order to become an empire. The Manchus could actually build on the basis of their tribal coalition or tribal ties, and then importing or introducing into the Ming imperial system the something like Li Fanyuan to effectively hold together the bits and pieces of their large empire. And then the third point here, which he made, of course, was about this ginseng trade and Nurhaci achieving a certain degree of monopoly through the exercise of armed protection of his monopoly over the ginseng trade. Now here, I confess, this is a point that Professor Wakeman does not get much into. So the comparison with the great enterprise ends here. But then here, it's also that the place where Professor D. Cosmo gets into the whole issue of trade balance between Manchuria and Ming proper, and gets into an exercise in the valuation of the volume of the trade. Now, I confess that I find it somewhat mystifying that how a ginseng trade coming out of Manchuria would end up absorbing nearly 1/4, right, or over 1/4 of the silver that was coming into the Chinese empire. I confess to be somewhat, shall we say, amazed by the magnitude of the trade as well as the magnitude of the valuation of ginseng as such. So that for that purpose, I would actually just like to ask some very commonplace questions. Namely, what was the volume of the ginseng trade? what would be the production process or the mechanisms and trading patterns and routes and so forth of ginseng? How does one fix price actually for ginseng, etc.? So if it's possible to take those figures and measure those against the possible market for consumption of ginseng, namely pretty much the size of the Chinese empire, how the production and the consumption of ginseng, if evaluated at this level, how that might look like. In other words, I'm slightly skeptical about the magnitude of the trade, but I know that he was simply saying that it was a suggestion. He was not drawing his conclusion, not yet anyway. But nonetheless, this ginseng trade is very important because on the basis of his argument about the ginseng trade, silver then flows into Manchuria in large quantities, making it possible to pay for the firearms, making it possible to pay for the standing army, and including the allegiance of the Chinese traitors. And then if we focus on, in other words, it's ginseng that's powering or paying for this entire arms race between the Manchus and the Ming, and then fueling the Manchu or sustaining the Manchu capacity to carry on warfare. So ginseng does sound very, very important in that regard. Hence, it would probably be very, very interesting to figure out how many ginsengs were there and who consumed them anyway at such a price. That would be what almost the equivalent of how it would take to build a new nation or a new dynasty. I mean, yet another way of putting it is to say that all these people praying for longevity in Suzhou, in Hangzhou, in Nanjing, in Beijing, etc., unbeknownst to themselves, were consuming enough, right? Consuming enough as to devour their own empire. Or, I mean, they were paying out enough money as to support the Manchu's capacity to put an entire military machine out there in the field, which eventually will take Beijing and put down the three feudatories and march all the way from one end to the continent, not to mention that eventually reaching Kashgar and present-day Xinjiang. So with those as sort of my interpretive understanding of Professor D. Cosmo's extremely interesting paper or provocative paper, I suppose, here is a paper that is trying to rewrite the history of the great enterprise. This is the great enterprise, and yet coming from the perspectives of people on the other side of the border. So if that is the case, I do find it extremely interesting, but then at the same time, I suppose I would like to ask just a couple of very tiny questions. First of all, it's totally possible that he's talking about Nurhaci, whereas Wakeman was talking about Huang Taiji. So that between these father and son, the two generations, maybe what calls for what we'll need for a reconciliation between Professor D. Cosmo's work and Professor Wakeman's book it's not about the contrast between, for different kinds of confrontation, rise of the Qing, but rather the differences between two generations, right? So that's one possibility. Another one here, small question here is that it seems to me that it's totally possible that we are here dealing with firearms, multiple wives, and lots of silver or lots of money as an alternative symbol of of Manchu prowess or Manchu origin. But then, on the other hand, if one were to think about the issue of ethnicity, the way that Crossley or Eliot had put it, that is, whether to start out with the earlier time, or, as in Mark's case, the 8 banners and whatnot, those people seem to be presenting a Manchu warrior, the image of a Manchu warrior that's not particularly interested in firearms. In other words, they appear to be still shooting and writing. And then also, yet another thing there was that they were busy practicing their Manchu language, but then they didn't mind not doing other things. So I simply wonder about, on that point, as an issue about Manchu ethnic marker, if it was guns, it was silver, and many wives, tribal alliances through marriage arrangements, which in the end really tilt the balance, then why writing, shooting in Manchu language, or as markers of Manchu ethnicity? And then, in fact, the one question that I do have is really about the whole issue of modernity. And what do you mean by modernity? Does that simply mean that it's about a capacity, and after you sell enough ginseng, accumulate enough silver, and you buy over enough Han traders, you arm your troops with guns, you change your mode of warfare, and at the same time you build up your tribal alliance with people from principally from Mongolia, that you are able hence to seize more. So does that mean that in this capacity to take more, is that sufficient in itself as an argument about Manchu modernity? Or does modernity, our understanding of modernity, require something else? Something a little bit more in addition to that. Something about a certain maybe capacity to overcome the deficiency in manpower, resources, or skills. In other words, exactly the kinds of things that the Manchus appear to be collecting in abundance thanks to ginseng trade and other things. So in other words, my question here is, what do you mean by modernity? If abundance as such is good enough for modernity, or does modernity might need to imply a change in paradigm or in dynamics in terms of a capacity to overcome the necessity to rely upon an abundant supply of all those things, such as manpower, resources, and technology. And finally, it's a wonderful story. It's an extremely provocative set of suggestions that you put together for this wonderful presentation. And if one were to you didn't exactly show me your footnotes. So if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to hear about your sources or number or the way that you handle some of these data. But anyway, so my presentation, as you know, the division of labor here is simply to offer a comparative appreciation by setting it in the context of my reading of the Wakeman book of Professor D. Cosmo's presentation. Now it falls upon him to do a self-criticism.
Thank you. Maybe I should.
Why don't you sit there? I'll stay here, and I will help sort of call on people and then also keep time. So we have about half an hour, and
Shall I just use 2 minutes?
Yes, please. Use more time. Please use
first
more
of
than
all,
self-criticism.
First of all, the self-criticism, and but before that, thank you for your remarks. I mean, they really help. And let me just begin by saying one thing, and that is that I am really not dealing with Qing history after 1644. I really don't have any problem with the way in which most people talk about the construction of the Qing state after 1644. I just think that what comes before the 1644 is not considered in a way that is appropriate to the later conceptualization of the Qing. For instance, if we consider what you have defined, I think, as the happy synthesis between Manchus and Chinese in the 1680s, after the Three Feudatories rebellion, one of the questions that has been asked is, well, why were the Manchus so inviting to the Chinese to create that happy synthesis? And the answers to that question are not, I think, good enough. The Manchus were already agricultural before coming into China, and therefore they were some more malleable, more synthesizable, and so on. I mean, these type of questions, I think, are very simplistic, and we need to look at the transformation of Manchu society in order to understand the happy synthesis a little better. So my self-criticism, I think very little of what I say is actually new. I'm taking theoretical props from a number of fields. Japanese scholars have talked about economic and social developments of Manchu society before 1644, have done a lot of interesting work. Even Jurchen society during the Ming, the issue of the commercialization of the frontier is very well established. I'm not saying anything actually new there. Same thing with the military revolution. I mean, the question of the impact of a war on society is well established in its theoretical coordinates. The problem is studying the society and studying the war and putting the two together. But clearly, a number of European societies see an acceleration, for instance, in the centralization of power. Once they need to centralize, they have a standing army, they have a centralized production of heavy weaponry, and so on and so forth. So that is actually a process that is being studied for about 50 years in the European context. It's not been studied in the Manchu or Chinese context, and I think it should. We should pay more attention to issues of mobilizations, training, armaments, and so forth. The other self-criticism is that I don't have too many bones to pick, you understand, is that I really think that I've only started to isolate some threads, but I've not been able to knit them together into a new theory of the Manchu conquest of China. I'm looking at these these separate threads, but I need to weave them together in a better way and to see how. But it's not very easy, of course, to do this, because we need to go to the Manchu or Mongolian documents. You asked me about the sources. A lot of these sources are in Manchu, but a lot of them are in Mongolian, in fact. About 30% Mongolian, 70% Manchu, roughly. For Professor Nakami might comment better than I can on the Manchu and Mongolian sources. But I've translated some of these documents. Japanese, Chinese scholars are translating quite a lot. We have a number of archival materials now available. It is possible, actually, to look at these sources. And the more we look at these sources, the clearer it is, in my view, that it is the Manchu society is being transformed in very radical ways from the early 1600s. So, to go back to the question of modernity and what is modernity, I think really new forms of socialization emerge. For instance, within Manchu society, we have the beginning of a kind of proto-urban centers or proto-urban when Korean war prisoners, like Im Il-hwan, for instance, or Sin Jun-il, visit the Manchu capital, they find a bustling activity of artisans and soldiers, courtiers. It's a very, very dynamic place. And this did not exist before Nurhaci centralized resources and created all those workshops and towns. He had 4 different capitals before entering China. In each of these capitals, we find a growing number of urban sort of protagonists, a new urban class. These artisans, these bureaucrats, and so on, traders. So Manchu society is being transformed in ways that are still to be explored, but certainly there is a different configuration in southern Manchuria than what we find in northern Manchuria, for instance, not to mention places like Heilongjiang or eastern Manchuria, where the effects of this commercialization are not felt in the same way. I'm also skeptical about the notion that ginseng sales can amount to a quarter of the foreign imports of silver into China. But the more I look at it, the more difficult, my skepticism is still there, but I have to confront these figures. And these figures are not agreed upon by everybody. I mean, there's a lot of discordance among scholars, and a lot of silver came into China through smuggling. It's not recorded. It's illegal trade and so forth. So we can never really hope to quantify exactly. But still, compared to the output of the Manchurian economy, that is very significant, even though it may not be significant in terms of the Chinese economy. That is what I sort of stressed. That, and also, we must say that sometimes there is irony in history.
Yes.
And we cannot necessarily exclude the fact that the Chinese willingness to buy expensive northeastern products may eventually lead to their downfall.
Praying for longevity.
Praying for longevity. I think an analogy with the trade balance between the U.S. and China might serve as a cautionary tale, perhaps. So I certainly need to look more into this and to try to quantify, but I still think that the ways in which the Manchus exploited this favorable commercial situation that combines availability of silver and growing demand for ginseng from Manchuria, they basically exploit the situation that is created at that time. When there is, in fact, more silver than there was before in China. So that is also maybe, as you suggested, a function of modernity, this new way of acquiring and using resources. But I still think that the centralized institution, centralization of power is very important, which happens under Nurhaci, but is also more so under Huang Daiji, I think. There's even more centralization and more control. About ethnicity and ethnic markers, if I were to just put it very crudely, I would say that the early Manchus cared more for money than for ethnicity, and more for winning wars, no matter what, than for preserving their ethnic nature. There is a question of of preserving your ethnic nature, but you cannot do that if you don't win your battles. And winning battles is important. They certainly preserve the traditional way of fighting, riding and shooting and so on, rather than developing their own artillery, their own firearms. And I think it was just more convenient to use the Chinese in that respect. There is a whole issue about reception of firearms in certain society. There may be a certain resistance to change one's own training, one's own identity as a soldier. But that has to be distinguished from changing the army. They were perfectly willing to change the army. They were maybe more ready to do so by acquiring skills already obtaining among the Chinese or the Koreans than not changing themselves. The persistence of ethnic markers like language, and sometimes I think there is a little bit an overemphasis. I think Marx's work was really, in some ways, fundamentally revolutionary in the sense that it reshaped our understanding of the Manchus as not just an agent that synicized and therefore changed nature in some ways, became Chinese, and that's it. No, they stayed Manchus, and that was important throughout the Qing history in different ways, I think. Nevertheless, sometimes, in my translation of this Manchu soldier's diary, there are very few, or no, in fact, no direct statements of Manchu ethnicity. He is a soldier. He's fighting together with other soldiers. They may be Mongol, maybe Chinese, maybe anything. But yeah, his military identity seems to be more important than his Manchu identity. So sometimes it's a matter of interpretation. And we are in danger sometimes of taking a cultural marker for an ethnic marker or something. If I identify myself as a soldier primarily, and I value my sort of culture as a soldier, my military culture, that doesn't mean automatically that I identify myself only with Manchu soldier. No. So I don't want to take all the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So floor is open. If you have questions, call me, please.
I have two questions, but before that I want to cover some of the mystic of silver. My understanding, the Jinsen is not only the money maker, Manchu is foreign and parent. It is, there is wonderful description about the Chinese woman in trading for parrot goat or something. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the very popular item of Manchu-China trade, and then plus that not only Chinese but Russians, they were crazy of parrots, so they want to import that into European market. And the recipe for this food was
fell first.
And then it is not the silver import to northern border is not about the trade; it's about wartime. So, with the rise of Manchu and Mongol, they wanted to station a lot of troops there. So they wanted to feed them. So they wanted to how they gonna do. So they sent silver there, and then they kind of used that to buy grapes and everything. And then one of the Chinese general Wang Chongyuan, he was very powerful Chinese general, but he had some kind of collusion with Manchu, and then actually gave them money and then used them as some kind of his alliance, and then gave money to buy parrot and Jinsen or something like that. So it's not just about silver and Jinsen trade. There are a lot of more silver involved in this situation. And And then I have two questions actually. I really appreciate your emphasis on global kind of dynamics of all the rise of Manchu, because as a graduate student writing on the dissertation of the Qing, and I was kind of close topic or something like that. I mean, the so-called view Qing history, they wanted to kind of solve the problem of Qing by looking at what happened within Qing, not around Qing. So it's kind of very close topic, but I mean, your perspective is totally different from that. So I really appreciate that. And then talking about the globalization and global configuration of Manchu rise, actually Manchu was not the only regime who fed off silver to buy European arms and then became very powerful military power. There was Chong Gong, he fed on the silver to import the European arm and everything. There are wonderful books by Anthony Reid about the whole Southeast Asian country, which was during that time fed off the silver to buy the European arm. So it's kind of some kind of global situation, and then it's kind of a maritime situation. Then it so it's in that regard, I think it's very interesting that the establishment of Manchu regime was concluded by fighting with Chong Gong. That they were kind of two same kind of regime, and then one of them won over the other kind of the same kind of regime. So what I'm getting at is that, is there any possibility to see Manchu as some kind of rather than invasion power, more like maritime power, which would fit in the context of the silver circulation of during 16th to 18th century? It's kind of what is that? And then the other one.
That's only one question, Colleen?
It is one, and then there are one more.
And another question is also 10 minutes?
No.
All right.
I think the other part of your argument is the military revolution thesis and the compound thesis. And then what is important about that is not that they use the military power, firearm. It is more about how they kind of use of firearm, and then the war-like situation transformed societies. I didn't really see that part. How that, I mean, in your book, in your article, in other books, that kind of use of firearm led the inclusion of Chinese to Manchu banner. But other than that, there's something more than that. And then, in that regard, you are not the only one. The people who use similar kind of problematic to solve the change of Hansu and Chinese economy during the 18th century. So how do you see yourself in regard to Peter Purdue's
Peter Purdue. So after comparison with the great enterprise, here comes what China marches west.
These are two complicated questions, but I think it's not. I mean, to start from the second one, it's not such a minor thing that the bannermen, the banner society includes also Chinese bannermen and Mongolian bannermen and Manchu bannermen. I mean, these are the people who actually conquered China. So it's called by Evelyn Roski and others the conquest elite. And so this is one way in which the Manchus used the Chinese was not for bureaucratic purposes, was because they had firearms in the first place. And then they used the bureaucrats and the literati and so forth. So it's not such a minor event, I think, that you start to have a multinational sort of elite with different specializations. And they became these Shandong generals who joined the Manchus became very influential. They were the ones who persuaded other Chinese generals to defect, to change sides. So it's really, there's a ripple effect there also. The Mongols massacred the Chinese. The Manchus didn't. So it's not such a minor issue, this one. But why did they ask the Chinese to join them at some point? Why did they bribe them, really? Because war was important, because this was an important aspect of the war at that time. They would not have solved the problem, tactical, operational problem of having siege equipment without that solution. And without siege warfare, probably those border fortresses would have held out for a much longer period of time. So we don't know how, but certainly the Manchu army and the elite and so forth was transformed. So the relationship between Manchus and Chinese needs to take that into account. Your first question was?
The possibility of seeing Manchu as some
Oh, yeah. The global, there is quite a lot of work on the circulation of firearms in Southeast Asia, but that develops a little later, I think, after the conquest. And are the Manchus a maritime power before the conquest? I don't think so. There is no evidence that I know. Certainly there is a maritime issue in the conflict with Mao and Long. Mao and Long was a Chinese general in Korea, actually, one of the islands, who was running a sort of guerrilla warfare against the Manchus, and that gave the Manchus a lot of problems. But I don't think the Manchus can be regarded as a maritime power. Although I must say that Evelyn Roski is working on relations between the Koreans, Japan, and Manchuria in that period of time. So maybe her research will unveil some maritime sites that I'm not aware of right now.
Margaret?
Thank you very much for your talk. This is perhaps an overly simplistic question, but when and why does a Manchu desire to win battles give way to a Manchu desire for conquest over China?
It's not a simplistic question, it's a very good question, because we always have to keep in mind that in the 1620s, the Manchus did not know that they were going to conquer China. It's important to keep things in that perspective. And there are disagreements as to whether they ever intended to conquer China and when that intention is revealed and so forth. So it's a very good question. But I think at some point, especially after 1619 and the first large Manchu Ming expedition against the Manchus, I think the Manchus had become sort of mortal enemies with the Ming. They knew that. And they knew that the Ming were trying to maneuver the Koreans and the Mongols and the Ming themselves to wipe out the Manchus. So I think it was really a struggle for survival. At some point, there is no way to go back, to turn back. And either you continue to fight, or you disappear. And I think the general feeling in the Manchu move to Liaodong was this one, that they had to establish themselves and win their battles, otherwise they would have been wiped out. how do I know that? that is the general feeling. I think you can get it from for instance, the instability in the Manchu rulership at this time. Some Manchu aristocrats start, for instance, pillaging and looting and mistreating the local population, and they just cannot afford to have that sort of resistance in Liaodong. So Amin and a number of other Manchu aristocrats are punished for these kind of things by Huntaiji. I mean, there is really a psychological difference, let's say, and they have to preserve what they have as much as possible. That's why they don't engage in a full war against the Mongols. That's why they wait about Korea. The preservation of resources becomes very important at that time. And I think that's a fairly clear indication that they are preserving resources because they are on a defensive stance. And whether they know what's going to happen, I don't think they know. But I think they are surviving year after year, month after month. Is that an answer? Okay.
It's not often that one hears a presentation that is so conceptually clear and at the same time bold. I enjoyed this talk immensely. It's both clear and also daring. And I'm, of course, speaking from as an outsider to this particular field. What I particularly liked was you're providing a new frame for thinking about the Manchus for conquest. I mean, it seems to me what it's really getting at is what you just alluded to a second ago, is the teleology of conquest. The idea that the history is funneling this group of people inevitably towards a particular end, which happens to be the conquest of China, and is calling all of this into question, which I think is a good sort of it's a very healthy thing for us to kind of think through. It's so often the case that China specialists don't really believe in the reality of the things that happen elsewhere until they come under this kind of big spotlight that is China and Chineseness, and sort of once it's on the dimness there of kind of spade wings and so on, doesn't really count. Once it comes into the spotlight, it's then to be interpreted in Chinese terms. What I thought was impressive about this was that you're showing us that this is at the very beginning, it's an intersection of something that had already developed in a very complex way with another whole set of things and with really unforeseeable consequences, quite possible. The only specific point I'd like to make is that I think that there's a real synergy between two of your 3 points, and that is the economic development and the military development. I mean, leaving aside whether it's 25% or 15% of this or whatever, which I don't think matters. What I do think matters is the clear implication for that, that it's obviously true that you have a very substantial commercialization of at least part of this culture going on. And money is, and I mean money, is flowing in. And when this money flows in, all sorts of things can then happen that can't possibly happen without that money coming in. And one of the many things that can happen is that you can militarize. And you mentioned the examples yourself. Well, militarization then in turn helps generate further revolutionary changes in society. I found this, these two things and the way they interact very impressive indeed. So I'd like to hear a lot.
Well, thank you very much. I think this question of militarization is very important. I've used it in another paper to explain also certain internal changes in Eurasian societies, how that generates a need for external resources and so more centralization of power and so forth. But part of my paper is also about this Eurasian tradition of politics that I think is very important. And the way that these Manchus, Nurhaci, Huntaijians are using these traditional tools is incredibly smart. And incredibly smart, and it also provokes certain consequences that cannot be foreseen in the beginning. It's trial and error to a certain degree, but they are using in new ways, in really creative ways, some of the implements in the toolbox, let's say, of Indonesian politics. And the Mongols are much more ideological in their state building, far more based on genealogy, on religious support from the Tibetan hierarchies. And so they think, the Mongols, that once you are a descendant of Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan, and once you have the support of the Dalai Lama, then you can become the new Khan of the Mongols. And that's not so. There is a political process that the Manchus use much better than the Mongols. So the Mongols, failing that natural, ideologically based, let's say, form of authority, they resort to violence, because people don't recognize that they are superior, their right to create an empire, so they resort to violence. And the violence in the Mongol world at this time is enormous. It's just, we don't see that, looking at it from the Chinese point of view. But there's an enormous amount of turmoil and violence there. And as I said in the talk, one caravan, 3,000 people completely wiped out. And these are common occurrences. So the Manchus are looking at that world and saying, how can we manage this situation? And the way in which they manage the situation is very, very impressive, I think, politically, very smart. So I think we have to give them credit for being smart.
We do. Beth?
Do you want to keep going?
Yeah.
But they're also fast, right? I have a question about time. The changes you described took about 40 years, maybe 2 generations. Is that long enough? I mean, it wasn't long enough for the military revolution in Europe, and it wasn't long enough for the military revolution in Japan, I think. 40 years, if you take 1860 to 1900, that's 40 years, and yeah, Japan was transformed fast. But 40 years somehow in the 17th century seems a pretty economical time scale for the kinds of things you're describing.
It's a smaller society. So this is a partial answer. We are not talking about France. We're not talking about Spain. We are talking about approximately 800,000 people living in southern Manchuria. So 800,000, 1 million, it's hard to... so it's not a particularly... it's impressive for being so fast, but there are precedents. There is, and this is another self-criticism, that there is an issue of institutions that appear very suddenly, like the banners. Where do the banners come from? And that's an interesting question, because a lot of people assume that they exist in a kind of political memory of these Indonesian people, because we can find analogous development with the Jin, with the Mongols, with the Turks, and with all these people in Indonesian history, hundreds of years before the Manchus. So this is a problem that we have to address. The fact that certain institutions appear very quickly, and the banners is the classic type. Capitals are established quickly, and they take a complex form right away. So how do they do this so quickly? And they do it. I mean, there is no question that they do it. The evidence is there, but how do they do it? That is not such an easy question to answer. What is the kind of background that they have in terms of simply political experience, because they don't resemble, Chinese institutions. They are not they're not borrowing. They are taking them from somewhere else, and where it's but an interesting issue also mentioned by Mark Elliott in one of his articles is that there is an historical consciousness of the Manchus that goes back a long time. Goes back to the Mongols, goes back to the Jin, goes back to the Liao dynasty, goes back a long time. So it's not excluded, I think, that previous experiences historically documented in the Chinese dynastic histories might have provided some examples. That's a very bold hypothesis, but I think there's enough evidence of literacy and advice among the Manchus that this is possible.
If that's the case, where do you see Manchu modernity taking the Manchus?
It depends when we are talking about. You mean after 1644, or before in this context?
So in this
Well, it's, first of all, it's a much more stratified society. So there are deep social changes. So it's a much stronger aristocracy. We have appanages that appear. It's a much less egalitarian society, much more stratified, much more vertical constructed. Wealth is distributed differently. There is greater urbanization in Manchuria. We are talking about this particular period. The army and the military hierarchies really define the Manchu aristocracy at this point, whereas before it was a complex of tribal aristocracy, not necessarily the army hierarchies. In one word, I could say the new aristocracy is more varied, is Manchu, is Mongol, is Chinese, it's also much more solidly established. They have more power. One interesting change is in the word Jushen. Jushen or Jushen is a word that means the Jushen state, the Manchu state, for instance, and also everybody was a Jushen before the 1630s, and then slowly this word Jushen for commoner or free person, individual, slowly becomes more of a word of a lower status, like a servant or even a slave, right? I mean, a Jushen is not really a very high-ranking member of society. It's Professor Nakami is certainly knowledgeable about these things, but Jushen is a class of Manchurian citizens above the slaves, below the aristocracy, that suddenly loses a lot of its standing, social standing, and becomes more of a very low class kind of category, just very close to a servant or a slave. And the aristocracy becomes a much more powerful class. So there are these social changes that are very important. I don't know if this is answering your question, but we are really moving into a different kind of society. And the property rights are different. The aristocracy sort of monopolizes a lot more of the trade, of the land property, of the slaves, and so forth. So this is where it's taking them, to a more hierarchical, more vertically organized, more rigid class society at that time. Then they conquer China and things change.
So in a way, it's Cyrus, please. A final question. Okay.
Yeah, my question is, you use a term like engendered concept like that. Can you describe social and economic changes of
Yes.
Manchuria? How do you deal with the problem of precedent? Like the Bohai state, the Liao, the Qidai, the Qin. Of course, when the Qin after 1644
Yes.
settles in the latter Qin, how do they perceive their own social
Well,
development to previous empires in the same region?
I don't think we can speak of these societies as one society, basically. I mean, I don't think we can say the Manchus are an evolution of the Jurchen state, and the Jin is an evolution of the Bohai. I don't think that. I think there are processes within each of these societies that develop in a different way, following militarization, unification, various social developments. But I should say that, I mean, I used modernity in a rather provocative way in this. I don't want to concentrate on this word modernity so far. I mean, what I said is, things change to the point that there is no way back. And I think there is a point when, a tipping point, when centralization of power, the power of the aristocracy has grown so much that there is no way back. But beyond that, I don't think that we can make easy analogies between Manchu, 16th century Manchus, 12th century Jin, Jurchen, or 9th century or 10th century Bohai. I think all of these processes have to be studied in their own terms, because also the international, I mean, what's happening around them is different. I've emphasized these international or global connections with the rise of the Manchus. The same could be done for the Mongols or the Jin. And about the latter Jin, there is an issue. I mean, it's in the Manchu sources only once we find Amaga Aishinguron, that is the late Jin state. Only once. It's very interesting that the latter Jin or the later Jin is only mentioned once in the Manchu sources. Typically, it's just called Aishinguron or Jushinguron, that is the Jin state. So, how they saw the relationship with the early Jin dynasty there's still a question there. I wouldn't put my hand on the fire that they saw themselves purely as a reincarnation of the Jin state.
All right, so I have other questions, but I'll pursue those over refreshment. So on that, we have come to the end of our allotted time. Please join me in thanking Professor Di Cosmo for a most interesting, provocative, original, and carefully researched paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.